All right, Doctor, we're recording, so whenever you're ready, you may begin or you can ask questions.
Okay. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm James Harrell. I'm a physician, and just to describe what I did, when you go through undergraduate school, like I started at the University of Florida in 1956, and then in 1960 I was in the 5th medical school class at the University of Florida. And then after you finish that 4 years of medical school, you go intern somewhere for 1 year. And I went to Charity Hospital in New Orleans, which has been quite a bit in the news lately from all the problems with Katrina. And I spent a year out there taking a rotating internship, which means I'd be on an emergency room 1 month, on the surgical service for a couple of months, OB/GYN service for a couple of months, medicine, and then I took surgical subspecialties. And that's when I got married, because that was 1964-65, and my wife graduated midterm, so she got out Christmas of 1964, and we got married in the Christmas holidays. And so she came out to New Orleans, obviously, and we spent 6 months there, and then I went in the Army after that. And if you get the time frame, Vietnam was starting to blow probably in the 64-65 area of time. And we got out of med school in '64, and after interning, you're a doctor. Now you can take care of folks on your own. And I finished that in 1965. There were 40 doctors in my class. 38 of them were going in the military because there was essentially a doctor draft on. And everybody almost was getting a tour in Vietnam. Some got assigned to Germany, and that was the assignment of choice, because if you got assigned to Germany for 2 years, you're going to be there for 2 years. But they called every doctor who was assigned to Germany in and said, you have 1 or 2 choices. Give us an extra year and spend 3 years in Germany, or expect a change of assignment, which meant Vietnam. And most of them signed up to Germany and had a good time. And then I came back after the military duty of 2 years and went back to the University of Florida for 4 more years of OB/GYN. So you don't become a specialist until after the internship. So if you have somebody who's a general surgeon or an internal medicine doctor or a thoracic surgeon or a belly surgeon, orthopedic surgeon, they've had anywhere from 3 to 5 years after internship to do that. And that kind of sets up about where I would be as a general medical officer. I was a general practitioner, but trained. We spent 6 weeks in San Antonio training to become military doctors. And because medicine is not a straight, you got to do it this way type thing. Everybody's trained does things differently. And you can't have somebody with a broken leg treated one way at our hospital in Cu Chi, and the next day be in Saigon, and 2 days later be in Japan, or a burn injury who is seriously ill at our location, and they'll take an airplane and fly that person to San Antonio to the burn center. Only person on the plane if they need to. And so you had the experience of, at different levels of getting taken care of. And that's basically what we did. I went over in January 1st of 1967, and you may well remember that, everybody, the Bowl Championship Series is a big thing now. Well, back in those days, January 1st, you had about 5 football games back to back to back, and from that they decided the national championship. And I really wasn't much excited when I climbed on the airplane in Jacksonville at Imeson Airport on my way to Vietnam on January 1st, 1967. So football wasn't really, I still wanted my team to win, but you were thinking other thoughts too.
What is your most vivid memory of the war?
There is no one vivid memory, because as I was showing some of those pictures there, almost everywhere you involved in things that you never forget, and not all of them were bad either. And as an example, I have some letters there that I would write Gail, my new bride. When I was over there, I wrote every day if I could, and usually I did. And it's interesting that I can go back 42 years later and almost word for word talk about a scene that happened, and go back and read that letter and find it exactly as it was. So these people, the World War II vets who tell you things that happened, 70 years ago? and they've got a memory of it, they remember. They remember. And vivid memories, I think the whole experience, you have different memories that come and go depending on what things happen. One thing that was real bad for me that fortunately I didn't know about was what happened to my wife when I went over there, because she went back to the University of Florida. And she had one graduate, she was reading one of my letters, and I had pictures there from Vietnam and waiting on class to start. And one graduate student walked up to her and said, somebody in Vietnam? And she said, yes, my husband. And she said, why didn't he go to Canada? Canada was the place they would go to avoid going to the war or the draft, as the case may be. And she said, well, he's doing his duty. And he said, I hope he comes home in a body bag. I mean, it was just vicious, what she went through. And as we go on, there'll be more things that'll come up. There'll obviously be things that I remember vividly. But one of the things I remember so well was what a great experience it was to have people like those helicopter pilots get people into your location where you could do something for them. And in World War II, if you had a horrible injury to the leg, they put a tourniquet on, and many hours or days later when you got back, you were alive, but you lost that leg. And they could bring them in by those helicopters, and they come in off those helicopters with horrible injuries. And you could have an artery spurting blood out, and you could literally speak and take them in and sew the artery up, and a week later they'd be okay. Not a week later, but you know what I mean.
While practicing medicine, did you ever think you would become an award-winning soldier?
There was certainly the thought that I would become a soldier because, as we mentioned, Vietnam had a long history. And the Indochina experience that ended with the French and at Dien Bien Phu, the Americans kind of gradually took over after that. That was about 1953, 54 when that happened. And Americans gradually took over. And then in 1964, the war was almost over because the communists had cut the country, almost cut the country in half. And that's when the first American troops went in. The 25th Division that I was part of went in to the Pleiku area to save the Central Highlands from being cutting the country in half, and the Marines went up at Da Nang, up at the very top part of the country. And that was really the American start of it. And then in 1965, we stabilized the war where they couldn't win. And in 1966, Westmoreland built that country up, ready to take the offense. And in 1967, he took the offense. And that's when I went over, January 1, 1967. There were already a lot of doctors there, but there were 5 doctors on the same airplane I was on going over, going to the same location. And only one of them had more time left in the Army than I did, and I was getting out in 6 months. But he was now going to take the offense, and it was time to send the docs over. And we were so well prepared for the casualties that we had.
Did you have a passion to fight for your country?
Well, I think most people, there are some people, honest to goodness, that's their motive in going into it. And I was a little bit different because, I knew I was going in the Army, and I would probably end up in Vietnam. And I felt very comfortable going over there and taking care of the people. The one thing that you really long for, if you can imagine yourself being married 1.5 years or 2 years with a beautiful, beautiful lady, and you want to get back home to that lady. And so that is the central in your thoughts is, what can I do to help myself get back home, when my tour duty's over.
Which member of your family or a friend was most affected by your absence during the war?
Oh, certainly my wife. She went back to school, and as I've mentioned earlier, some of the things she put up with, and certainly she was most affected, and that's true with any military family. Your family are very much affected. Other people be going to work, going to school, and have no idea what's going on until they read in the newspaper where somebody was killed. But that was the first war that was seen live on TV. Every night at 6:30, the news networks would be on, and the lead-off thing every time was Vietnam. And if you can imagine, we had no way of communicating except by letters, really. They did have the Mars thing, which was nice, where you could get the ham radio people to patch calls through, and then telephone call your wife and you could talk for a few minutes with them, but that was rare that you could do something. Mostly it was letters. But the nightly news had what happened in Vietnam today. And you can imagine my wife knowing that I was with the 25th Division, that I was up northwest of Saigon, up at Cu Chi. And the nightly news starting off and saying elements of the 25th Division were ambushed today northwest of Cu Chi, and there were 7 dead and 30 wounded. You're not going to hear for a week about your husband unless he happened to be one of the people that were hurt. And it's so different now because you know, they can communicate, literally speaking, from a hospital bed in Baghdad to a cell phone to whoever you're talking to. And your parents are all involved. My mother lost one of her 2 brothers in World War II, and she had 5 children, 4 boys and 1 girl. And all of us were involved in the military from one side or another. Usually 2 brothers went to Georgia Tech on an ROTC scholarship, and they served in the Navy. And I went to Vietnam. My younger brother was in the Navy, and he made 2 tours to the Western Pacific, which are usually 6 months with the Navy. And my sister was married to a guy that was on the Riverine Patrol as a naval officer in Vietnam. So our whole family was very much involved.
Did you meet anyone in battle that you became close with?
Yes, we still have friends with doctors. And also, not only in battle, but people that I knew back home who ended up in Vietnam at the same time I was. You know, you already knew them. But for the most part, they were doctors that I knew. One of them now is in practice up in St. Louis. We periodically communicate. One is in Arizona. And I must admit, I'm a right-wing Republican guy, and he's about as big a left-wing guy as you could find. And so our politics really weren't changed a whole lot by that particular experience. But yes, we do have friends that we still communicate with, and some you wish you communicate with and have trouble finding. I've got pictures of some of them that I would love to send to them now, you know, 40 years later and say, hey, that's you. Mm-hmm. And I've had trouble finding them.
Right. What were your surroundings like in battle?
Well, for the most part, you got to remember that the Viet Cong picked every battle. They picked the time, the place, the odds, you know, everything about it. And he never won a battle. So in reality, most people in my position weren't in battle. But you are always in a situation where it didn't matter where you were, where they could suddenly start dropping mortar rounds in, even in a big base camp. Base camps bigger than Stuart, Florida. I mean, literally speaking, a division has 25,000 guys in it. And a lot of those are support troops, but you have the combat troops out in the woods. And we took the fight to them out in the woods. It was rare that you were in a battle in a city in Vietnam. The time that was different was Tet of 1968, where they attacked the cities from one end of the country to the other. And that was brutal, what went on then, and brutal for the civilians. But for the most part, the action the Americans were in were out in the woods, away from where the civilians were, because we were going out, mostly out by the Cambodian border and in areas in between there to interdict them coming across from Cambodia coming in. So battles, you know, it does scare you, and particularly when you're first there. I remember when I first got in the country, I was with a medical battalion. There were about 25 doctors there, and then a support group that would take care of about 1,000 guys altogether to take care of that. And we were stationed at Cu Chi, which was a massive big base. And as things were positioned, if my tent with a bunk in it, a large, you know, you'd have 8 or 10 guys in a tent there, was here, and the Viet Cong were out there, they had a battery of 175 millimeter howitzers back over here. So when they fired out toward the Viet Cong, it was going right over my head. You know, and I sat up every night, you know, wondering if that was a mortar round coming in. And until you finally have a mortar round coming in, you have no idea what it's like and what the difference is. But after one time, you never forget. Never forget.
Did you feel like you were fully equipped and mentally ready to fight in the war when you were recruited?
Sure, because if you get down to it, from a doctor's point of view, there's certain things that you learn to do, and I learned them really basically when I was in New Orleans intern. I can pull up on a car wreck today with somebody seriously injured and go through the steps 1, 2, 3, 4 to resuscitate that person. And so you're trained to do that. And then the Army also goes about training. And what was the second part of that question you had?
Were you mentally ready to fight the war?
And I was scared because I wanted to be back home with my wife. But still, you were prepared for that. And as a doctor, for the most part, you were, sometimes it's like a pilot. You know, you're kind of doing sick call, which is nothing big, just like it is over here, most of the time. But every once in a while, they said, okay, mass casualties are coming in. And they had such a good setup because our little hospital had about 30 or 40 beds, but there was an evac hospital 3 or 4 blocks down that could take care of anything that came in. You know, they had the surgical specialties there. And we were the emergency room, basically, is what it was. And when you had mass casualties coming in, which happened a few times while I was there, it was very simple. They bring in a Chinook helicopter and take any walking wounded out of our hospital, and they could take 30 at a time like that, and fly them 100 miles away to a hospital where there's no action. And now we're ready, and we had the number of people there to take care of the wounded. But the real saving grace was the helicopter pilots. They would fly into anything to get one U.S. litter, meaning a guy on a stretcher, he couldn't walk. They would go in to get them, and they could get them to us where we could be very effective in helping them, medically speaking.
Did you yourself have any severe injuries?
No, I had no injuries. A couple of times, matter of fact, let me show you. One night we were watching a movie. It was probably about 8:30, 9 o'clock, and they had a movie out there on a big screen. And all of a sudden, I saw a little cone. It looked like a little fireworks. It went up just a little bit, maybe about this high. You know, what was that? And all of a sudden, the one word in English that you never, ever, ever forget has a new meaning when somebody screamed, incoming. And that place cleared out so fast because we had bunkers around. And I got in that bunker and I was feeling real good, you know. I was in the bunker and the mortar rounds aren't gonna hurt you if you're in a bunker. And after about 10 minutes, word came around on the communication devices they had there. All doctors report to the accident room. So I borrowed somebody's helmet, somebody's flak vest, and away I went, you know, duck walking as I got there. And they were just bringing casualties in there. And we took care of them. And it was a tin building that you could take the people coming in off the helicopter on stretchers, and you walk into the emergency room area and they had sawhorses sitting there. And they just put those stretchers right on a sawhorse and you're working on them. And the building was tin, and anything could penetrate that. I mean, it wasn't any big thing. And so we took care of our casualties, and a couple of funny stories about that did happen. But the next morning, I went out in front where they're bringing the troops in through our door, and about 30 feet away, I picked up this little piece of thing. And that's a piece of shrapnel from either a recoilless rifle or a mortar round, or a big mortar round that was made in communist China. And as you saw a few minutes ago, that is razor sharp now. And you can imagine something like that flying into you, and it's about 20 feet away, laying out there on the ground. And so you realize that just by luck alone, it didn't come my way. And you see strange things that happen where other people are hurt terribly and somebody standing next to them aren't hurt at all. And so you do get a little frightened, I think is a fair way to say, you know, at certain times. Most of the time it's boredom.
Do you feel important because you are such an amazing part of our American history?
I realize that because it's meant, you know, like I said, going back to World War II, I had 2 uncles who were in that, one who got killed, and the other went 4 years, you know, before he came home. And fortunately, we had R&R, and you know, we'd spend a week in Hawaii, and I met Gail there, and I met her again back in Thailand. So I had 2 weeks away from the war during those times. But special, I think, it was just an honor and a privilege to be there to help those guys who were really hurt. And we had such a good system set up for it, and the communists just had nothing. Just if one of their guys get those same injuries, they would, if they survived, it'd just be a miracle. because they'd have to drag them all the way back to Cambodia to where they didn't have helicopters to take them either. And if they were in a vehicle, they would have been in trouble because, you know, we have spotters in the air looking for things like that. But it is a special feeling, and there's a saying on a T-shirt that some Vietnam vets wear: for those who fought for it, freedom has a flavor the sheltered will never know. And that's true. And that's true, because you've been there. And you can argue all you want about what war is good, what war is bad. I think all wars are bad, but by the same token, there's some that have to be fought. And Vietnam was one of those that just had to be fought. A lot of people disagree with me. But you give me an hour and I'll convince you.
Do you think it is necessary for you to tell your story to future generations?
Sure, because, I mean, even look at, you know, the wonderful things going on at this school. I mean, my wife grew up in Sarasota, and she started a new school, you know, went to the 11th grade, no seniors, and her athletic teams, not talking about academics now, but athletic, in her 3 years in high school, they never won a football game, a basketball game, a soccer game, a softball game, didn't win a thing. And when you come out here to Jensen Beach High School and say state championship softball teams, state championship soccer teams, real stars in softball, I mean, it's great. And then academic, look at the schools in Martin County, and this is just a great example of our 4 kids went through the public schools all the way through. And what a great example of teachers who really care and can get the kids prepared for whatever they want or desire to do. You know, it's just a blessing.
How is your life now?
Well, I did OB-GYN here. Like I said, when I came back, I went through OB-GYN for about 4 years up at the University of Florida, and then moved here in 1971. So we were here when your grandmother was very, very active politically and did a very nice job. And I worked hard, you know, for quite a few years, and after about 15 of those years went by, we got the malpractice problem in obstetrics got so bad. There were 3 of us working together, the Harrell, Houston, Holder group, and interestingly enough, all 3 of us served in the military, you know, at those times. And but we decided to quit doing OB because of the malpractice problem. And so I then went by myself and did GYN, and my wife ran the office for the years after that. And one of the doctors is still in practice doing OB-GYN up in Murphy, North Carolina, and one of them still does office work here, but he doesn't do any more surgery. But for me, I had a lot of medical problems that were unrelated to the military, where I became an insulin-dependent diabetic 4 years after I, you know, got out of the Army. And I'd like to speculate that probably it was caused by problems over there, but there is no way they'll ever have the number of people who suddenly became an insulin-dependent diabetic, bam, to prove one way or another, because there are very few people like that, and you have to have a large number to prove that I was a victim of the Agent Orange. Where if you're a diabetic who gets a little older and a little bit obese and gets type 2 diabetes, you know, that is now considered a problem from Vietnam, and they get compensated for that. But I've got a much worse form, and there are about 4 major complications you can have from that, and I've had 2 of them. You know, you can have visual problems where you lose your sight. You can have peripheral vascular disease where you get amputations gradually and lose your extremities from vascular disease. You can have heart attacks, and you can have kidney failure. And I've had the heart attack, and I've had the kidney failure, and had a kidney transplant about 9 years ago now. That's this past April 24th. And that kidney transplant is working wonderfully, but it left the medicines I have to take leave me with enough of a tremor where you don't want me operating on you. So I'm out of medicine. But so I'm now retired, but the time that I had the surgical procedure, the heart, the vessel disease that was repaired there, was in the year 2000, and that's the year my wife won her seat as a state legislator in the state of Florida. And she was just term limited out this past year after being 8 years in that, ran for Congress and got beat by 1,000 votes. And she has failed retirement. She's going to run again. And we both love politics. And certainly my politics is colored by what happened in Vietnam and the experience of us bugging out and not only getting the United States out of there, but leaving the South Vietnamese alone. And then we had to help them out one time because about a year and a half after we bugged out, we were finally out of there in 1973. After about a year and a half of that, the communists launched a major offensive coming in from the north and from Cambodia against now just the South Vietnamese. And our B-52s and fighter aircraft helped out greatly in stopping that. And then about a year and a half later, not only did they stop that, they quit giving the Vietnamese weapons and supplies to fight, and then quit giving them money. And then the settlement that took place in 1975, we know left about 800 U.S. pilots in North Vietnam. Part of the negotiation was that we would give them about $4 to $5 billion to repair their country and leave 200,000 combat troops in South Vietnam so they could take over South Vietnam. That was part of the thing. And then when they tried to get to $4 to $5 billion, the communists were suspecting we probably wouldn't fulfill that promise, even though it was written down. And so they kept back about 800 U.S. prisoner of war people who were almost all pilots. And they knew they were alive and over there. And they have never been accounted for. And to me, that is one of the most tragic things that our government ever did, was just to bug out and leave those guys there and knew they were there and alive.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think, you know, again, some of the things that happened to you, you know, I as a doctor had certain things that I was more aware of than the average guy. We were in a convoy one time. We were going from Cu Chi to Tay Ninh, which was maybe about, 40 miles up the road up there. And the convoys traveled real slow. You know, you got, literally speaking, a division. If you've got a division of vehicles, you've probably got 50 miles of road covered with one right after another when they're going out on an operation. And we stopped in Trang Bang, the vehicles slowed down. And of course, everybody came to the vehicles hawking things. And you see these guys buying these popsicles. And I'm sitting in that vehicle thinking, popsicles, that's cold. Now, if you wanted to take a germ, a salmonella, or something that's called diarrhea or hepatitis or something like, well, hepatitis is a virus, but a germ like salmonella, if you want to preserve it, what would you do? You'd make it cold. And if they're making that popsicle and they got germs in there and they freeze them down or get them cold, and now you're eating them and you're getting salmonella in you, and I'm sitting there, man, I wouldn't eat that for anything. And that's just my approach to it. And then part of my preservation, I spent about 2.5 months with a medical battalion back in Cu Chi, and then I got reassigned to a combat engineer battalion, the 65th Combat Engineers. And a battalion has about 1,000 guys in it. And these guys, I mean, you get so much respect for what they do. There was an area out by the Saigon River that the Viet Cong had been in for about 40 years. Nobody had ever gotten them out of there. And they had Cu Chi, where I was famous for the tunnels of Cu Chi. They had underground tunnels connecting everything, but in reality, the VC didn't spend much time in those tunnels. They lived in the villages, and they would go in there if problems were occurring, or if they were sneaking in to create a problem. And so we went out there, and I was kind of scared going out with a combat engineer battalion because now I was going out to the woods. But the first 2 days, we set up out there a perimeter, and they had the biggest bulldozers you have ever seen. And our job was to go out there where the Agent Orange could not get rid of that forest and destroy that forest. And that picture I showed you of me coming up out of the tunnel, you couldn't see 6 feet away that I was there. But we went in there with those big bulldozers. They had helicopters overhead and big numbers on the bulldozer. 32, move a little bit to your right. And they would just put it in gear and go, and they just mow down everything there. And if they had bigger trees, the engineers would come around behind them and wrap a plastic charge around and blow them. And And so in about 6 weeks, you could look 2 miles across and see the Saigon River. And then my youngest daughter, Melinda, was the first graduate of Martin County High School and was in the ROTC program, and she was the first graduate to get a 4-year scholarship. She was admitted to the Naval Academy and Air Force Academy, but she took an Air Force ROTC scholarship and went to Georgetown and spent 4 years at Georgetown. Now, she owed military 4 years from that. But when she got ready to graduate, said, Melinda, what do you want for a graduation present? I want to go back to Vietnam with you. So in about 1997, we went back. And my oldest daughter was a gifted writer and still is. She got her PhD in creative writing. And the three of us went back to Vietnam. Gail wouldn't go. She wouldn't go. But we went back, and I had maps. Every morning, I'd go in the bunker where the intelligence information was, had a big map on the wall, and every action that had taken place the day before, you could mark on the map where it was and what happened. You know, a firefight took place here, 3 guys injured, 5 VC killed, you know, and it'd have the location there. Every morning I went in there, and I had maps in my pocket because I knew where I was all the time. And if I got in an area where I didn't belong, I'd know if you go that way, that's where action took place with a VC. If you go that way, there isn't any action. So I knew which way to go. And so when we got out there, I knew that we were in a wooded area out there and we were going to destroy that jungle. But I also knew the village next door was not a safe place. And they would send me on med caps to go pacify the civilians in there. And so we went in to do our med cap, and they'd get the village chief in there and use his house as a place, and we'd give out, depending on the problem they had, you didn't have any diagnostic tools except your stethoscope, and you didn't have x-ray or anything like that. But you treat these folks, you know, and a lot of things you could treat, you know, fungal infections and need antibiotics for various things, very helpful. But we took a picture of me and the chief and the village chief there. And when we went back, that was a place that was up north of Trang Bang, up towards the Saigon River, and it was about maybe a mile and a half from where our base camp was set up. And we went back to find that guy. And we were there and couldn't find him. But I had a picture of his house, and there really, you know, wasn't a big place, but we just couldn't find it. So at their little equivalent of their 7-Eleven, I left the pictures. And, you know, people told me, oh, I think he got killed by such and such. I think he was, you know, left and went to, we just couldn't find it. And when I got home, I have over there a letter I received from his daughter in Saigon. Somebody had given that picture to them and found that person. And our guide over there, who was a South Vietnamese officer, but now he was just trying to make a living, and charged $20 a day to be a guide for us. And our guide went back up and visited them again and got a picture of him sitting there, and he was Viet Cong. But he was in an area where if you don't control the country at night, then he had no choice. You know, if literally speaking, I saw pictures where teachers in a community who might say something bad, this is usually in outlying areas, they might say something bad about the Viet Cong, and literally speaking, at their house the next morning, their head would be on a post with the family inside, you know. I mean, brutal things. But this guy was Viet Cong. And we got in touch with him, and he was just so pleased that I gave him a picture, that this American officer gave him a picture that he probably had not in his house. And here was his family. And Johnny too got that picture of them and got a bigger picture and did that. And but when I went out to the woods, I was kind of scared, you know, about mortars, because our perimeter now was much smaller. It was about maybe 4 times the size of your football stadium out here. The first 2 days we had trenchers going around, and all they would do is dig a hole about this wide, however deep you wanted, usually about 4.5, 5 feet, so you could be standing up in there and fight out of it. I mean, you had a trench there. And they dug trenches around, and then about 20, 30 yards out, dug another trench around, so the tents were set up in between. And if mortar rounds came in, you could be in a position to fight real quick like, and have a certain amount of safety around you. Well, I was worried about mortar rounds. Say, hey, what's going to, you know, what about the troops take care of the doctor? I said, Doc, we'll take care of it. And a big D9 bulldozer came up, and dug a hole in about 30 seconds. And it was underground, so bullets couldn't get to you. And then I said, well, you know, there are things that come like that, you know, mortar rounds. They'll drop in on top. Doc, we'll take care of you. A trencher pulled up. And about 8-10 feet away, he dug a trench that was probably about 7 or 8 feet deep. And they put steel bars across, steel across, 3 or 4 layers of sandbags, made the entrance so if a round hit here, it'd have to go there and make a 90-degree turn to get to me. I said, Doc, all you got to do is get in that tunnel, and you're okay. You know, a bunker at that time, you know. And so, and they would take care of the doc. They would, but also the doc was very valuable to them when things happened. And it was amazing to see. I showed you some pictures of a vehicle that was horribly damaged. And an RPG round, a bazooka type round, hit that, and the guys were inside that one. And not only that, it was a gasoline run thing. So it caught fire. And all those guys were hurt. Nobody died, but they would be hurt quite bad. And 5 minutes away was an air-conditioned hospital where you could take care of those guys with a helicopter bring them in. And I think one of the most impressive things, you ask about things that you really remembered. We were at lunch one day back at the medical battalion. And you know, we'd sit down and have at a table and have real good food. Wasn't any problem. Word came in, mass casualties were coming in. So all the doctors left and we went back to the emergency room. Nothing happened. Nobody was coming in. So I went over to the communication bunker, which was right next door to that, and went in, and I could now hear the communication taking place between the helicopter pilots and things like that, because this was the center where all the medevacs went out for the whole 25,000 guys in our area. And the Saigon River was, probably about 5 miles away from us. And in this particular operation, the 1st Infantry Division with 25,000 guys was coming through a place called the Iron Triangle. That was another Viet Cong stronghold. Been there for years. And we were going in on the south side with of the river with the 25th Division and putting blocking forces in. And if they tried to come across the river to escape, we had them. And so they were dropping these guys with 25th Division into a rice paddy about maybe half a mile from the river. And when they took off, dropped the guys in and took off, 2 sides of that were fortified VC bunkers. And they were just tearing our guys up. And there were medevacs trying to get in and had big Red Cross on. And as they'd come in and get close to where they could pick up the wounded guys, they'd cut down on the medevacs and they'd fly back up and they'd bring the jets in again and put napalm or whatever they needed, or bombs, whatever they needed, to try and silence those guns. He came in a second time and same thing happened to him. You know, he had to fly out, and there was another medevac out there with the 2 of them. And then the 3rd time he got in, he got on the ground. And they got 3 leaders on, which those helicopters would hold, and they got 3 walking wounded guys who could get in and sit down somewhere. And a 4th walking wounded was getting in when they got the range again, and they hit him and knocked him off the helicopter as he was climbing on. So the helicopter took off. And so, and the next thing I heard, I was listening on the radio, and the 2nd helicopter up above, never forget a guy's name who was flying it, Fernandez. He said, Fernandez, they got your fuel tank. Fuel is pouring out as he was taking off. He said, your helicopter's gonna explode. Set down the Saigon River and I'll come in, we'll get as many out as we can. Because there's no way you'd get everybody out of a, you know, when the helicopter's in the river and you're trying to transfer people from one helicopter to another. But he said, I'll get as many of you out as you can. Radio went dead. I thought, he blew up. And what seemed like forever, he came back on, he says, I'm going back to Cu Chi. So I went out and told the guys, you know, hey, they're coming. And we got out and you could see them coming over the horizon, 2 helicopters. They sat down at the airfield where we were just down from them, next to the fire engine. And the other guy got them out and brought them into us. And it was just they would fly into anything to get a U.S. soldier. When I was out in the woods, we were about 30 miles north of, northwest of our base camp when I was with the engineers, and I was scared. You know, and I was in a pretty safe position, and one night about 1 o'clock, you know, I slept with my boots on. You know, you had a cot there, and I used mosquito net, and none of the guys did, but I knew there's malaria out there, and you couldn't convince them to use mosquito net, but I did. I was going home with that wife well. And so about 1 o'clock in the morning, woke me up and said, hey, Doc, our colonel out of those 1,000 guys would take about 10 or 15 guys and send out an ambush patrol every night. He was a soldier. He was not going to let them sneak up on our unit. And so they woke me up and said, you know, the ambush patrol's been hit and their folks are down. They need you out there. And you know, I knew there was nothing more I could do than a medic out there because you don't have any equipment. You know, you just need to get them. I said, well, you know, my medic's out there. And he said, Doc, your medic's down. So I got in an armored personnel carrier and big Red Cross on it, and they took a flamethrower tracked vehicle that had it honest to goodness would throw a thing of fire from here out to your football field. It was an armored personnel carrier, but it was, you know, in that way it was. And so I went out there with them, and we got out there. One of the guys was dead, and the other guy had been hit in the hip. And it was one of those horrible nights, no moon, you know, just the ceiling was about 500 feet, and we were 30 miles away from the nearest helicopter. And we weren't out but about 300 or 400 yards, and by the time we came back into perimeter, a medevac helicopter was landing between 4 flambeaus, you know, to get those guys hurt. They would go anywhere to get them, anytime.
Well, thank you.
Any other questions? Good. How about time, Howie?
I'm fine. Ben's got to go to practice. I want to ask you a couple questions.
Put them on me.
Well, I want to thank you. If it weren't for medical doctors over in Vietnam, I wouldn't be here. My father was wounded in Vietnam and was medevaced out of a rice paddy after he'd been out there for about 6 hours. And my godfather and my sister's godfather were all wounded over there. Some of them were really badly hurt, and they would have, if it wasn't for the doctors over there, they definitely would have died.
It was amazing. And that brings up another thing, the nurses. There were a lot of nurses over there. And at our particular unit, we had no nurses. We had a couple of nurses who would come over from the VAC hospital, but they had probably about 50 or 60 nurses down where the real surgery was being done. And they had a situation where the Vietnamese were called slant eyes.
Yeah.
Okay, and Americans were round eyes. And we had one guy come, he was so horribly hurt, he had one of these artillery fragments that went through his arm, into his chest, and was involved in his heart. And he was alive when he got there. And we had 8 doctors working on him, I'm not talking medics. You know, 6 of us trying to get blood into him. And the other 2 were treating his wounds. And there was a nurse who got to his head and was just wiping. He'd been in a paddy. You know what I'm talking about, you know, filthy. And just took a wash rag, washed his face off. He looked up at her and said, "Thanks, round eye." Just an American woman who was taking care of him. Yeah. And they worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. And they'd see all kind of things. They would take care of all kind of things, and they'd go back to work the next day. And a lot of those people are some of the neatest women who ever lived. And we have them here in Stewart. Are we still on?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're still, you know, there were nurses here who did just one hell of a job. And they were so much appreciated by those people who were involved with that. It was, and you know, intelligence was always a problem in Vietnam, talking about the intelligence corps. Yeah. And I remember we were on another big thing going up. We went up about 40 miles up to Tay Ninh, and then we were up about 2 or 3 miles from the Cambodian border. And I have a picture there of a bridge that had been destroyed. And the engineers have a thing where they go out and build a concrete slab, you know, sticking up on one side and the other. And we could come in with an Army armored personnel carrier that had a bridge on it and just flop that baby across. And now we could get across the river on that. And then when you got ready to leave, take your bridge with you and go back. But there's a picture there of the bridge that's been blown out by the Viet Cong before. And that we were about maybe 2 or 3 miles from the Cambodian border where we set up. And there were 2 interesting things about that in every war, there are women of ill repute earning a living with the guys. It just happens. And we didn't know where we were going. We were just in a vehicle driving, and they said, okay, you go over there. And that's where the battalion set up. Right across the street, out in the woods, was a little hut that had already been built with the girls from ill repute. Who knew we were coming to that location? And Cambodia being a short ways away, one night they had, okay, let's set everything up and everybody shoot over that way, because there wasn't anything friendly that way. And I put my little camera, a little 35mm camera, and put it on a time setting and got pictures of everybody firing their weapons out that way. And it's just amazing what, how many rounds they could put out in a given area, you know, at a given time. And the fireworks we have around here, they're interesting to watch, but there are a couple of times when action took place fairly near me, and you could see a firefight going on. And out in the woods, when it was with the Engineer Battalion, just before around sunset, some artillery post somewhere was marking your location, and they'd have a little shell come up and you'd go poof, and it'd be right over you. It wasn't an artillery shell, but it was a marker. And that was a unit somewhere 5, 8, 10 miles away who was taking care of us for the night. So if we were attacked, then everything would start taking place as Westmoreland set it up. And this happened when I was up at Tay Ninh. There's a 3,000-foot mountain up there, and not another hill within 40 miles. And they called it the Black Virgin Mountain. Nui Wa Din was the name of it. And we controlled the top with Special Forces and had equipment up there to vector in B-52 strikes. And the bottom we had a Special Forces camp, and the rest of it was VC. And a little village over there was VC. And a sidelight, one of the guys came in with gonorrhea. I said, how in the hell did you get this out here in the woods? I spent the night in that village over there. I said, you lucky son of a gun. You know, you lucky your throat wasn't cut. But they had a firefight about 10 miles away in the spring of '67. Lyndon Johnson was flying to Guam to meet the president of Vietnam. And the VC wanted a big victory. And one of these artillery posts out there was out in the woods. They'd set up with about 100 guys out there with these big cannons. And anywhere in country, they could call in help right now, and you had somebody watching your back. And they had, it was one of those bad nights, you know, no moon, and they had 3,000 VC come out of the woods to hit that outpost of 100. And they were going to kill everybody there and then drag their people away who were dead. And the next morning, there'd be 100 US dead and no VC. Everything worked. They hit that place, and the artillery, they said, we're coming in from the east, and the artillery starts putting things out, and you don't know how much our artillery does until you see a short round land on our guys, and they can get them to us quick. And that is devastating stuff to have going out at you. And they had beehive rounds. They lowered their cannons down to ground level and pumped beehive rounds. It'll kill everything. You know, a 50-yard by 100-yard swath is just gone. And they were coming in human waves on them. And the doctor of the division artillery doctor was at that position that night. And a big sergeant told him, pushed him down the hole and said, don't you come up. You know, because he knew what was happening. And so the artillery fired in. You got helicopter gunships with 2 million candle power flares circling around up there, and as one flare hits the ground, another one's already on its way down. So it lights it up like an eerie daylight. And you can see what's happening. And about, a mile away, there was an infantry unit that had probably 200 guys bivouacked out in that area that night. But it wasn't at that artillery post. So they set, you know, out to come help these guys. They sent the word out to us back at the Black Virgin Mountain where that Special Forces camp was, and we had plenty of guys there. And the infantry went out to, it was none of this thing, hold down until the morning and we'll be out there. Everybody moved. And they had blown a bridge between us and them. Well, we had a bridge, put the bridge across. And the first armored personnel carriers to get out there with infantry, there were so many Viet Cong as they were running over them, literally speaking. And the jets out of Saigon came, the Dragon ship came, and you know, he's putting out 5,000 rounds a minute, you know, per second. I mean, just, you know, they tell him which area to go to. And the tanks were coming in, and we won the battle, is what happened. And the next morning, there were about, there were 27, I know I counted them, there were 27 dead out of that 100 guys. And the rest of them were pretty well wounded, but they were, you know, most of them were going to be okay. And there were 837 bodies they counted the next day, Viet Cong. And Time magazine wrote, it was just, when this battle took place, just an obvious example of the Army misleading the statistics about how many people they were killing. And U.S. News and World Report reported it for exactly what it was worth, you know, because that's exactly what happened. But it was set up like that, because wherever the battle took place, you had help coming, and they weren't going to wait till the morning. We had the best troops in the world. And if your family was involved, you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. You know, when you're over there and you're a surgeon, you obviously going to see a lot of things that are going to be, you know, shocking and kind of, you know, not pleasant, and quite frankly probably you know, make you wonder if you can go on the next day. Was there any experiences that you saw that kind of were life affirming, or things that kind of, you know, you made a bit like one day you really had a lot of casualties, the next day you saw something that really kind of put your hopes up? Anything kind of positive happened to you?
Oh, there were always positive things. This goes back to Gale some too. One day they had these little Lambretta motor scooters out there. It was a little guy just riding a motorcycle, and behind him he had a U-shaped thing. And they put Vietnamese people, women, children, be on the back of that thing. That's how they got from town to town, you know, if they were poor. These little things just scooting down the road. One of them hit a mine designed for us. And they helicoptered those women and children into our location. And they were horribly hurt, just blown, you know, but we could take care of them, you know, and we did. And we got them to our hospital, did what surgery was necessary, and then eventually they would be transferred out to Vietnamese hospital, where the care couldn't have been as good because they didn't have the resources we had. But that I always remember, seeing those kids and the women who were hurt there. And my wife's going to school in Gainesville with people who hold up a sign, "We're child killers, killing children over there." You know, and it's just so big a lie. You know, yes, people get hurt, but most of our fighting was done out in the woods, not in the villages. When the Viet Cong wanted to have a battle in the village, they had one. And we bring in whatever resources you need to take care of it. That little girl that had pictures of her being burned by a napalm bomb, that wasn't American, it was a South Vietnamese pilot that did that. But you're going to have collateral casualties any way you work at it. And from a medical point of view, you can see the same type things in the big emergency room down at Jackson Memorial or Charity Hospital in New Orleans. There isn't anything that can happen to a person that you haven't already taken care of in a thing like that. And yes, it's brutal, it's bad, and you do the best you can. And but you go on. We had no follow-up. You know, when they went to the VAC hospital, they were bad. They'd be down in Saigon the next day, and on a medevac flight, depending on how stable they were, the next day. But you'd see them back home when you came home. And the ability of the medical corps, the hospital ship Repose went to Da Nang, where the Marine Corps was, way up in the northern part of the country. And it was tied up stationary. And it was a hospital working there for the Marine Corps. And the Forrestal was a big aircraft carrier, and he was off Yankee Station up, you know, with flights going to North Vietnam, and he had 2 aircraft, all loaded with all its ordnance, getting ready to take off, you know, on the catapult. And for some reason, one of the airplanes coming up behind him, going to be the next one on the catapult, a Sidewinder missile went off. And it flew up the tailpipe of this jet with this jet engine, you know, revving up, and just boom, he was gone. You know, it blew the plane up, and they had 500-pound bombs on board, and they were going off 3 decks below. And so they sent the word out that we're going to have mass casualties, and they wanted to get those. So they wanted the hospital ship Repose, which hadn't moved for 3 years, to set sail. And they were about to tell them how many casualties they had, because the VC would know, the North Vietnamese would know. And David McMillan, who was a neurosurgeon here, he's gone now, he moved up to the Orlando area, but he was a classmate of mine, and he was a flight surgeon for the Navy. And he was on the Oriskany out in that area. And they put him on a helicopter and flew him over to a cruiser, and they were getting the people bad hurt off the carrier in case it sank. And he said the hospital ship repo set sail, and they were helicoptering people who could off the ship to shore-based stations and getting crew members who were on leave back on. And they, I don't know how long a ride it was out to where they were in range, but the Macmillan there were 3 doctors now on board the cruiser who were taking care of casualties, and most of them hurt pretty bad. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, he said they got a telegram, or that wasn't not a telegram, but they got, message from the repos and said, we are now in helicopter range and prepared to take your first 750 casualties. And meant it. Just amazing, support. Just a real good job. And the things they're doing now are even bigger than that. These horrible injuries from the improvised explosive devices. Matter of fact, you want to have somebody come out here and talk. Luke Murphy. He was a kid that went to South Fork. He was a state champ in track. And about 5 years out of high school, he was in the Army, and he got hit by an improvised explosive device, and he lost his right leg, and the other one was horribly hurt, and he had other injuries. And his girlfriend was going to FSU. And they got him to Baghdad, and we took him out to supper, and the girlfriend was sitting right there, and said she was going to class one day, and the phone rang. And it was Luke in a hospital in Baghdad. And he said, honey, I'm okay. Got a scratch on my right leg. She said, I knew his leg was gone. And it was. And she quit school and went up there. She had a friend up by Annapolis and moved up there. And for 9 months while he was in Walter Reed, she was with him. And I don't know why yet, but they've broken up since. But right now, he's got his prosthesis, and he'll be in any race that you'll have. He's now taking political science at FSU, and he says, I'm set for life. He's minus a leg, but the military will take care of him the rest of his life, literally speaking. And he's going places.
Yeah, I have a couple friends who got injured real bad over there.
Yeah, and some of them, it's the end of the world. Yeah. So I characterize the people who are over there and come back in 3 categories. The overwhelming majority of people, a lot of them draftees, went over there, were normal when they went over, and they were normal when they came back. And you had a certain number of people who would get in such a bad situation that they'll never be normal again, emotionally or whatever. And then you had kooks who went over and kooks who came back. Because that was in the drug times, in the late 70s. When they went through our battalion, one officer went through our battalion at 2 o'clock in the morning looking for marijuana. And out of 1,000 guys, he found 1 reefer. 1. And that was in '67. We were winning. And when the war was over, those guys, who's going to be the last one to die? Yeah. Putting hand grenades on the bunk of officers who gave them bad orders. It was a different ballgame. Yeah, if you had family, Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Or say about your experiences over there?
It was sure nice getting on that bird and flying home. It was nice meeting my wife in Hawaii and in Thailand too. I mean, there was respite for. I did have one kid who was a medic, and when I was with the engineer battalion, and he went to not Indonesia. He went to over on the other side of Burma. Drew a blank, but it was an R&R center. And he came back from there. He's a nice kid from Mississippi. And he'd met this girl over there and wanted to marry her and had to have the officer's permission to do it. And I said, look, I'll tell you what, when you get out of Vietnam here, you go back to Mississippi, and if you want to marry her, you send for her and then marry her. Because you just know it wouldn't have worked. No way. And but he'd had a week in paradise, and that was him. But I did not give him permission to marry her, and I'm sure he married somebody else when he got back to Mississippi.
Well, Doctor, I really appreciate you coming. You're a fascinating person to listen to. I'm just going to take your microphone off real quick. Put that down here.
actually, sometimes the kids have work obligations and everything, so.
Oh, okay.
That's why she.
I've been a
she
kid
kinda
too.
Scooted out, so, yeah, they are always like, I've gotta get to work, I've gotta get here, so, thank you